Now, the Niagara Region Anti-Racism Association is asking for Niagara Region Councillors to make some reviews of the Niagara Regional Police budget. Joining us now to discuss from the Niagara Region's Anti-Racism Association is Saleh Waziruddin. Good afternoon, Saleh.
Hi, Steph. Thanks for having me on. As you said, I'm Saleh Waziruddin from the Niagara Region Anti-Racism Association.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to join us. And the association has sent an open letter to Niagara Region Councillors. And if you want to see it at 610CKTB.com, you can go ahead and read it. But Saleh, I'll let you give us the text of the context of what you're asking for in that open letter.
Sure, Steph. Well, basically, we're saying that regional councillors can't have it both ways. They can't say no to the transit budget because they think it's not fiscally responsible and turn some permanent workers into temps, even though they're not costing more. Again, saying that it's because of fiscal responsibility. But then when we have a chance to reduce the police operating budget by about 8% of their calls, according to their 2020 report, come from things that don't need a police response, like a welfare check or mental health act calls. If the regional councillors don't say the police, come back and reduce those calls and we'll shift them over to a civilian service, then they can't say they're being fiscally responsible. They can't have it both ways and say fiscal responsibility, we need to cut these other things, but not look at cutting things in the police calls that are screaming to be cut because you don't need an armed response for a welfare check or mental health call.
And I think, I think the police would agree with you on that. Saleh, is there currently a civilian group that you would suggest take on those 8% of calls? Well,
it have to be agencies that are specialized in mental health or social work. There's already been talk, I think, of the emergency medical service, which is already on the 911 dispatch. If you give them more resources to handle some of these calls, that would be one way. And as you mentioned, the police board themselves a few years ago said that the police are responding to a lot of calls that come from social problems, but they're not the right agency for that. I mean, they themselves are saying that, so why not oblige them and shift some of these calls over to people who are specialized in it? We wouldn't be the first ones to have done that. A couple of years ago, Edmonton did that. The police had asked for several $1 million increase, and they got just a $1 million increase, but the rest of it was spent on social services. But this isn't just about money. There's a much bigger reason. Last year, there was a black man killed in Fort Colborne, and the Special Investigations Unit report on that, which just came out recently, said the response, quote unquote, may not have been perfect. They realized, according to the report, the man had cognitive difficulties. And you can't, if somebody has cognitive difficulties, you can't respond to them the way you would with somebody who doesn't have that problem. You need people who are trained in that to address that. And he shouldn't have been, I believe he didn't need to have been killed. It's unnecessary to respond to it with an armed response. So if you agree that, Black Lives Matter, then you can't say that, may not have been good enough, may not have been perfect, quote unquote, is good enough. It's not. We need to shift these calls to people who are specialized to deal with them, not with a gun, but with specialization in mental health and social problems.
Saleh, we do have, I believe, in St. Catharines and Welland, in Niagara Falls, it might be, there is, and it's not 24 hours. I think we only have enough funding for one shift in all of those places where it is a project where someone who is trained in mental health is teamed up with a police officer to respond to calls. And we've spoken with them, and that project seems to be going well. Would you think that kind of program, expanding those kinds of efforts, might be a reasonable solution?
Well, you're right that it's not available 24 hours yet, although it is being expanded. But in this case, they could have used that according to the Special Investigations Unit report, because it looks like, from what I've read of the report, they didn't try to de-escalate with a mental health worker. And what we're saying is in the Niagara Region Anti-Racism Association, that you don't need a police response. You can just send a mental health worker, and if they need assistance, then they can call the police just like fire or emergency medical service would call the police. The first response doesn't need to be with an armed officer. So instead of just having a mental health worker go with the police, if there's a mental health call, then have a mental health worker respond. And then you can escalate if you need to. In the case of this black man who was killed, I mean, reports said, news stories said that he had a knife, but he could have been talked down from what the Special Investigations Unit report said. Instead of responding to a gun with a knife, responding to a knife with a gun, which is kind of a street fighting attitude. That's not what we need here.
Right. Saleh, I think, the other part of this too would be, I guess, developing, instead of 911, maybe another way to be calling in mental health calls, because the difficult thing is if we do have this sort of separate task force of civilians who are trained to respond, it would take maybe one incident where things do go violent for, the other side of people to come and say, no, we need to have police responding again, right? We don't want to put those people into danger because sometimes those mental health situations do become violent.
Well, if the mental health or social worker is responding and they believe that they need help from police, they can call police just like ambulance workers can or firefighters can. It can still be dispatched to 911. I mean, a person in distress or emergency can just call 911. The dispatcher can figure out, okay, well, this is where we need the police, or this is where we need EMS. EMS is already structured in 911. I mean, they could easily be expanded, I think, to address that. And there's already been some talk about that. But yeah, it doesn't. It wouldn't be the case that a mental health or social service worker would go out and just be vulnerable. If they needed support, they could call for it. The point is that the first response shouldn't just be with an armed officer.
I think also training, because I guess an argument could be made that in many of the things that police are responding to, I would think aside from car accidents, vehicle incidents, mental health is an aspect of it. And in general, I don't think our police have enough training in that realm.
Yeah, there is a bit of a mystery here because the police keep saying that the officers undergo regular training. But from the Niagara Region Anti-Racism Association, what we've pointed out is the numbers don't add up. If you look at the size of training classes and the frequency of the training, it doesn't match the number of officers. And we're being told that officers go through the training every year. I think that's a goal. So, it couldn't possibly be the case that every officer gets all of this training every year, and just because the numbers don't add up from the size of the classes and the frequency of the trainings that are offered. So there is a gap there we need to know more about. But even then, I mean, it's just as the police board themselves have said, that there's a lot of social problems, a lot of calls coming from the social problems that we have that aren't being adequately addressed through social services, and the police aren't the ones to respond to that. And as I mentioned, the Edmonton City Council had agreed with that earlier for exactly that problem. That's the reason why they reduced the increase in the police budget, and we'd like the Niagara Region to do the same.
We're speaking to Saleh Waziruddin from the Niagara Region Anti-Racism Association. You just mentioned numbers. Let's talk about numbers. So how much more is the police budget? What is the request? And would that difference make up and be enough to create this alternate task force that would respond instead?
Well, we know that the cost of a police officer is more than cost of mental health or social service workers. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. We know that about 8.5% of the calls from 2019 were welfare checks and mental health, just from the top calls. Now, I don't know how much of the budget that would be. We would need the police to break that down. So for that reason, the Regional Council should ask the police to come back with their operating budget where they say, okay, we won't be covering these calls. And then some of that money could be used for another service to do it. But for the exact number, it would have to be the police that would break that down. But it's going to be a significant chunk. I mean, if we're turning back the transit budget and we're even casualizing permanent employees, making them temporary, even though it's not going to make any difference in the cost, then for sure the regional council should look at saving money from a big chunk of the service calls being ones that don't need an armed response, welfare checks and mental health.
You've put together this open letter to councillors. Have you had an opportunity to speak with anyone yet?
No, and usually councillors don't often respond. I mean, I'm hoping that they bring up the point in the regional council meeting tonight at 6:30 with the budget review committee meeting. That's where I'm hoping that this is debated. I mean, there was a lot of debate already on sending back the transit budget, on casualizing some of the call center employees. So this definitely needs debate, not just for the financial reason, as I said, but because we've already had recently a black man killed by police where, according to the Special Investigations Unit report, there could have been more done to avoid the killing. So, I mean, that's reason enough, really.
All right, Saleh. Well, I know you will be on with Tim tomorrow morning. So in response to finding out if that is discussed this evening at 6:30. So we will stay tuned on that. And thank you so much for taking some time this afternoon on the drive.
Thanks for having me, Steph. Saleh Waziruddin with the Niagara Region Anti-Racism Association, and on socials we're the NRARA. Have a great day, Steph.
You too. Thank you, Saleh.